Herzlich willkommen zu unserer heutigen Sendung aus dem Energiestudio in Berlin. Wir wollen Ihnen heute den aktuellen Gas Market Report der Internationalen Energieagentur vorstellen. Mein Name ist Charlie Grüneberg, ich leite die Kommunikation bei Zukunft Gas. Und den Report selber werden uns die IEA-Experten Gergely Molnar vorstellen und sein Kollege Frederik Ritter. Wir sind schon sehr gespannt, denn mit dem Report zum zweiten Quartal blicken unsere Experten auch noch einmal auf den zurückliegenden Winter zurück und die gerade zu Ende gegangene Heizperiode. Und in den kommenden 60 Minuten wollen wir aber natürlich auch auf das nächste halbe Jahr blicken, wie sich die Gasnachfrage auf den schnell wachsenden asiatischen Märkten entwickelt und auch wie sich die zahlreichen geopolitischen Spannungen auf den Gasmarkt auswirken. Die Veranstaltung wird wie gewohnt aufgezeichnet und im Nachgang auf unserem YouTube-Kanal veröffentlicht. Wir senden Ihnen die Präsentationen der beiden Referenten, den Link zur Aufzeichnung und auch den Report später zu. Fragen, wenn Sie haben, worüber wir uns natürlich sehr freuen, oder wenn Sie sich an der Diskussion beteiligen wollen, dann nutzen Sie dafür bitte entweder die Chat-Funktion oder die Handhebefunktion. And now I will switch to English, and I'm very happy to have you, Gergely, here with us, and also a warm welcome to your colleague Frederik Ritter. It is always very interesting to hear from you what has happened in the last weeks in the gas market. There are a lot of interesting topics. So in the newest edition of the report, the IEA suggests a cautiously optimistic outlook for natural gas markets with a balanced supply-demand scenario expected for 2024, although the market faces significant risk from geopolitical tensions and supply chain disruptions. So more details now with Gergely Molnar and Frederik Ritter. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and many thanks, Charlie, for this very lovely introduction, and also it is a great pleasure to be here today with you, and many thanks for Zukunft Gas for organizing this webinar, which indeed has become traditional. So in the next couple of minutes we will present our latest quarterly gas report, which have been published just a couple of days ago last weekend, which is of course available free of charge on our website iea.org. The presentation is has four parts. First, we will provide an overview of the recent global market dynamics. Then we will discuss in a bit more detail Europe. Then we will move to the Asia-Pacific region, and last but not least, we will also present the most recent developments in the low-emission gases sphere, including biomethane, low-emissions hydrogen, and with that, let us jump into the presentation. On this slide, we are showing the evolution of global gas prices. TTF for Europe, Platts JKM for Asia, and Henry Hub for the United States. And maybe just to start with some good news, over the 23-24 winter season, we have seen that gas prices have been rather stable, and actually gas prices in Asia and Europe have fallen below their pre-crisis levels in the first quarter of 2024. Unseasonably mild weather conditions, improving supply fundamentals, and relatively high storage levels all contributed to the easing of the price environment. In Europe, gas prices have fallen to an average below $9 per MMBTU, the lowest Q1 average since 2021. And in the United States, we see that price dynamics are significantly more bearish. In March of this year, Henry Hub prices average at $1.50 per MMBTU, their lowest March level since 1992. And this is due to a combination of factors, including unseasonably mild weather conditions on one hand, and continued strong domestic production, including from the Permian Basin in the form of associated petroleum gas. And when we are looking at more recent developments in the United States, we also see that Waha prices in the Permian averaged at minus $1.3 per MMBTU in April, which is again is a reflection of the strong growth in associated petroleum gas, as well as weaker demand, and also not sufficient takeaway capacity from the Permian Basin. On this slide, we are showing how natural gas consumption evolved over the 23-24 winter season. Our latest estimates indicate that gas consumption increased by around 2% or 40 BCM. Of course, unseasonably mild weather conditions weighed on residential and commercial gas demand, especially in North America, but also to a certain extent in Europe. And we estimate that ResCom demand declined by around 1% in 2023-24 winter season. But when we are looking at industry, we see a robust growth. We estimate that combined industrial gas consumption in China, India, Europe, and the United States increased by 8% year on year over the 23-24 heating season. And approximately 40% of that growth is actually demand recovery from the quite low levels of 22 and 23, especially in Europe. And when we are looking at the power sector, we see that gas-fired generation has been really pulled into different directions across different regions in Europe and the major Asian markets. The expansion of renewables and improving nuclear availability has been weighing down on gas-fired power generation. Meanwhile, coal to gas switching dynamics in North America, lower hydro availability in certain South American countries, the continued growth in electricity demand in Asia, all contributed to higher gas-fired generation in those markets. Now, despite being a quite mild winter, we have also seen a few severe cold spells over the 23-24 heating season. In China, gas demand rose to an all-time high, a record of 1.4 BCM in mid-December, and we have seen also the utilization rates of the pipelines reaching an all-time high of 90%. In Russia, we have seen a very severe cold spell in January of this year, and gas consumption surged to an all-time high of 1.8 BCM in mid-January. In Europe, we have had a short-lived cold spell in the beginning of the year, which coincided not only with colder temperatures, but also with lower wind speeds. And as we can see on this chart, gas demand rose to 2.5 BCM, which is one of the highest daily demand on record. And of course, in the United States, the storm Heather has been driving up gas consumption quite steeply to almost 4 BCM per day on the 16th of January. And I think that those events highlight that it is important to focus on gas supply flexibility and also on the investments which are needed to secure the different gas supply flexibility mechanisms, which then can respond to these demand variations. This slide presents us with a view of our forecast for 2024. We expect global gas consumption to increase by 2.3 BCM or approximately 95 BCM, so by 2.3%, translating into 95 BCM. And in terms of sectoral contributions, we see that this is mainly driven by industry, which is expected to account for approximately 45% of incremental gas demand in 2024. This is partly supported by demand recovery in Europe, in certain price-sensitive Asian markets, but also structural growth in India, in China. In terms of regional breakdown, we expect that Asian Pacific markets, and Frederick will present on that in greater detail, but we expect that in those markets, gas consumption will increase by around 4%, and as such, the region will account for about 40% of global gas demand growth in 2024. And as we can see on this chart, this is very much supported by the expanding economic activity in that region, and as such, by higher industrial gas consumption. In the gas-rich markets of Eurasia, Middle East, and Africa, we expect that gas consumption will increase between 2.5 to 3%, and this growth will be mainly supported by industry as well as gas-fired power generation. And when we are looking to North America, the picture is a bit more mixed. Here we expect that gas consumption will increase by around 1%, primarily supported by the continued coal to gas switching in the power sector, some growth in industry. But of course, after the very mild Q1, we also expect a decline in residential and commercial gas demand. And in Central and South America, we do expect gas consumption to increase by less than 2%, mainly supported by higher gas burn, especially in those markets which are facing lower hydro availability, including in Colombia. And in Europe, we see again a mixed picture. We expect European gas consumption to increase by almost 2%, mainly on the back of some recovery in industrial gas consumption. But at the same time, we also expect that gas-fired power generation will continue to decline quite steeply in 2024. Now, this demand growth is, of course, supported by improving supply availability. And on this chart, we are showing how global gas trade has been evolving in recent years. And we consider the key channels of global gas trade as European pipeline imports, China's pipeline imports, and global LNG trade. And we see that after two quite difficult years when global gas trade contracted, in 2024, we expect some recovery happening in terms of global gas trade, which is supported partly by higher Russian pipe gas deliveries to China via the Power of Siberia pipeline system, but very importantly by the continued expansion of global LNG trade. So altogether, we expect that global LNG trade will increase by around 30 BCM in 2024. And on this slide, we are giving a closer look on what do we expect in terms of global LNG supply. In our forecast, global LNG production is increasing by around 3% or 16 BCM, which is, of course, well below the 8% growth rate experienced between 2016 and 2020. And what are the key contributors behind that growth? On one hand, North America, with the expected ramp-up of Freeport LNG, the commissioning of Altamira FLNG in Mexico, and the start-up of Plaquemines LNG, and some very good news, which are quite recent. Previously, Plaquemines LNG was expected to start operations towards the end of the year. Now, it seemed that the plant could start operations already in mid-2024. This news came after the publication of our report, and this also means that we might adjust upward our forecast for LNG production. When we are looking at Africa, we see improving feed gas availability in Nigeria, which is in a way almost counterbalanced by the lower feed gas availability in Egypt. But there are also new projects which are starting operations, including Congo FLNG, and Tortue FLNG is expected to start operations towards the end of the year. We also expect higher LNG exports from Russia due to lower maintenance at the existing LNG facilities in Yamal and Sakhalin 2. And also in this forecast, we don't include any shipments from the Arctic LNG 2 project. And last but not least, in Indonesia, the Tangguh LNG Train 3 is also ramping up production, mainly supplying the Asian markets. Now, after the global picture, we are now moving to Europe. And on this chart, we are showing how European gas consumption evolved over the 23-24 heating season. Altogether, European gas consumption declined marginally by around 1% or 3 BCM. And this has been partly due to lower heating demand, lower space heating demand because of the milder weather conditions. But as we can see on the chart, the key driver behind lower gas consumption was the power sector, and where we have seen that gas-fired generation declined by around 18% due to the strong expansion of renewables, which were up by 22%, and also improving nuclear availability, including in France. In contrast, we also see that gas use in industry has been increasing and rose by an estimated 15%, although the volumes remain well below, about 10% below their pre-crisis levels, and any further recovery is largely dependent on the price environment. As mentioned previously, we expect that European gas consumption will increase by around 2%, by less than 2% in 2024, mainly on the back of the expected recovery in industrial gas demand. Again, this recovery is quite fragile and largely dependent on the price environment. I think it is also interesting to look at what we see in Russia. And after the very steep declines in gas production in Russia in 2022 and 23, we started to see some recovery in Russian gas production over the 23-24 heating season. And we estimate that the country's gas production increased by around 7% year on year. And this has been driven both by stronger domestic demand as well as higher exports. And of course, Russian exports increased to China via the Power of Siberia pipeline system, which is in line with the contractual arrangements between Gazprom and CNPC. We have seen also stronger Russian piped gas deliveries to Uzbekistan in line with the contract signed last year. But I think what is also quite interesting to observe is the light blue bar, which indicates Russian piped exports to Europe, which has increased by an estimated 25% or 5.5 BCM over the 23-24 winter season. And this has been very much driven by higher deliveries to Turkey, but also we have seen stronger flows to the European Union. So this being said, the share of Russian piped gas in the total European gas demand is still below 10%, but I think that this is a trend we just would like to highlight. Now, maybe moving to a more positive story, Europe closed the 23-24 heating season with all-time high storage levels. At the moment, European storage sites are standing approximately 62% of their working capacity. And this also means that storage injection 35% below their 5-year average would suffice to reach the European Union's 90% fuel target by the start of the 24-25 heating season. And of course, lower injections could contribute to a further easing of market fundamentals. Now, this quite optimistic picture can be, of course, easily distorted by the forces of geopolitics. And just in the recent months, we have seen that how geopolitical tensions can impact the functioning of gas markets. We have seen that LNG trade practically dried up across the Red Sea due to tensions in the Middle East. We have seen that Arctic LNG 2 stopped gas production because of the shipping constraints and the broader sanction environment. We see that Russian missiles hit Ukrainian gas storages in recent weeks. And there is also, of course, a major uncertainty regarding Ukrainian gas transit as the long-term contract expires at the end of this year. So there is a lot of uncertainty which is stemming from geopolitical tensions. And what we see is that the gas markets are functioning very, very smoothly, but they are really at the mercy of geopolitical tensions. And we, of course, very closely monitoring the situation and provide update to our stakeholders. With that, I would like to pass on the floor to my colleague, Frederick, who will present on the Asian market developments. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Gergely. Hopefully everybody can hear me well. Thanks for the handover. And I'm glad to be able to shine the spotlight a little bit on the Asian market within this global balance for 2024. So on the next slide, I think we can get started with some of our messaging. By now, I think we all understand that the role that Asia can play as a motor for growth, and broadly the Pacific Basin as a motor for growth in both the global gas demand and the global LNG markets. Okay, so yeah, as I was saying, we know by now we understand by now the role of the Asia Pacific Basin as the motor for growth, right, in global gas demand, but as well as in LNG demand. When we look outside of Europe, Asia is that other huge import-dependent demand sink in the global market. So Asian market dynamics are key to understanding global market dynamics. And for context, just as a reminder, that Gergely brought this up a little bit earlier, but Asia Pacific accounts for about 40% of global gas demand growth in 2024, and for virtually all of the growth in LNG imports that we expect this year. So I think these two charts that we're showing here illustrate the situation. Here we're showing growth rates in gas demand on the left and LNG imports on the right, comparing various Asia-Pacific market segments to total world growth. And both charts show a similar story, but do add a little bit of independent detail. We see the impact of the 2022 supply crunch, particularly in LNG imports in this region. That's the chart on the right. And what is clear is how strongly the region has come out of this global gas supply crunch, outstripping global market growth. And within this region, what we see is that China and India, of course, maintain an outsized role in driving this growth. Now, other emerging Asian markets play somewhat of a smaller role when we look at overall gas demand growth. But when it comes to LNG imports, growth in this market segment of other emerging markets is definitely on par with what we observe in both China and India. So these were the markets that were heavily affected in 2022 by the supply crunch, and that roared back, we'll say, in 2023, and we expect more of the same in 2024. We can take this as evidence, in a sense, of just how much the gas story in these markets is, of course, linked to LNG market dynamics. Now, as a last takeaway here, let's turn to that dark blue line in the charts. That's overall Asia Pacific. It's important to note that this segmentation groups very different markets together, and notably some of the more mature markets and LNG markets that are today in decline. Nevertheless, what we see overall is that growth prospects in high potential and emerging gas markets in the region continue to outweigh the softer dynamics that we see in markets like Japan and markets like Korea, which we're not showing here on this chart. Now, on the next slide, we'll take a moment to zoom in on 2024 specifically and pull out some insights for what we see happening this year. Demand in the region is set to accelerate by around 1 percentage point higher compared to last year. So this is hinging on a strong enough economic outlook and a more favorable price environment in terms of LNG. So I think we're more broadly familiar with the breakdown that we see on the left-hand chart. This is mature markets declining, China as a largest volumetric contributor to growth, and India also adding quite a bit of increment here. At the top of each bar in these charts, we're showing the growth rate for 2024, and at the bottom of each column, we're showing the growth rate from 2023, just as a comparison. And this shows us a couple of things. First, the decline in mature markets is set to slow in 2024. We'll take a look at this in just a moment. Second, growth is relatively steady and robust in markets like China and India. These are the markets driving that volumetric growth. And third, growth accelerates in other emerging markets. And this can be traced back in part to this relatively favorable and more favorable LNG price environment that we see in 2024. Now, the chart on the right gives us another layer of understanding behind some of these points, notably when we focus in on the power sector. So in 2023, power sector gas burn stayed flat in the region, 0% growth, but different dynamics were at play behind this large geographical grouping. So while there was growth in the sector across many emerging markets, there was also a significant return of nuclear power generation in Japan, to a lesser extent Korea, but definitely Japan, which canceled out this growth in the other markets of the region. In 2024, there's less incremental nuclear generation returning to Northeast Asia. Of course, we see continued growth in both Japan and Korea, but we see a more steady environment for gas and power generation and more growth in smaller markets, high potential markets, as we mentioned earlier. So taken together, these two elements explain two further elements that we highlighted in the first chart on the left, the first being the slower decline in mature markets in 2024, thanks to nuclear or less nuclear coming in, and two, the faster growth expected in other Asia Pacific markets. Now, I focus here essentially on the power sector as a key element in accelerated growth in the region for 2024, but we cannot ignore the fact that industry does remain the largest sectoral component, so in terms of rate and in terms of volume across a number of markets in the region, and it accounts ultimately for 40% of incremental demand in the region. So this continues to be linked, as Gerge mentioned earlier, to a degree of industrialization, robust economic outlook, and growth in energy and particularly gas-intensive activity, right? Now, in the next chart, before we go to the inevitable zoom on China, let's stay a moment longer with this sectoral lens, we'll say, of the region, and particularly with an eye for the power sector. Now, here we're looking at gross incremental demand by sector in the region, and we're looking at the shares attributable to different markets. So what we see is that it's evidence that, of course, that light blue, China, accounts for the lion's share of growth. So that's more than 60% overall, and over 80% in certain market segments, certain sectors. But what we see is that in the power sector, China accounts for only, I put quotes around this, only a little more than 40%. So what we see is that much more of this growth in this sector will be dependent on smaller markets and on markets that are ultimately highly price sensitive and intrinsically linked to global LNG market dynamics. So while we see easing global market tensions helping drive some of this growth in this sector and in these other markets, it is important to keep in mind that any supply hiccups can also jeopardize or at least eat into some of this trajectory that we see for 2024. On this note, I think we can finalize this section on China with the next slide. Finally, one of the key messages to get across is that China is as much as ever the primary driver of global gas demand. It's been the case for a while, and we continue seeing this down the line. We expect 2024 demand growth to be only slightly lower than last year, despite a slower economic expansion. And this will be led, of course, by the industrial demand segment as outright new growth takes over from the recovery effect that we saw in much of 2023. And within this growth context, we expect the Chinese market to remain well supplied, of course. This means continued growth in domestic gas production, continued increases in pipeline deliveries, particularly from Russia, and of course, growing LNG imports. And this is what we see in the line chart on the right. So in 2024, we forecast Chinese LNG imports to surpass their 2021 record levels, not by a huge amount, but marginally surpass this level. This is in part helped by lower spot prices, of course, but particularly from past year's contracting spree that is now coming into effect. So while there are relatively limited, we'll say, incremental LNG volumes coming to the market in 2024, as Gerge pointed out earlier, a lot of this supply has been contracted in past years by Chinese companies. So just how much of this incremental volume China actually takes in will be a key element in gauging any potential market tensions this year, particularly in any potential case of supply-side complications. So this wraps up the Asia section with a few of the highlights, and I think it's also worth spending a little bit of time on a section that we included in our gas market report, focusing on low emissions gases. And on the next slide, what we're talking about, or what we see in this latest gas market report, is a focus and the spotlight on low emission gases, focusing on the demand side. So that's looking at how low emissions hydrogen, biomethane, e-methane, or synthetic methane, if you will, has been evolving in terms of policy focus and market mechanisms. I won't do a full recap of the section, but I think it's worth highlighting one of the key takeaways from this section, notably the importance of carefully designed support mechanisms that target the entire value chain. So from the supply side down to transmission and distribution, and finally, of course, end users. Now, this first slide focuses on biomethane as probably the more mature or most mature low emissions gas in terms of market developments. We've spoken about it here before. There's been a clear trend towards incentivizing the use of biomethane, both in transport and in grid blending. For a time, power generation was the key target segment for biomethane use, but as alternative and more competitive renewable and low emissions power sources have grown, I think focus in this field has started to shift towards other sectors. Now, the EU is quite advanced in terms of injecting biomethane into the grid, with EU level target of 35 BCM by 2030. Of course, there are big differences, as we all know, between member states. Denmark, on one end, has reached around 37% blending of biomethane. France is a little bit lower, of course, but still injected 9 terawatt hours of biomethane into the grid in 2023. And we've seen a significant increase in in production facilities over these past few years in the country. In the US, across the Atlantic, transport sector is where the most attention is being given to renewable or low emissions gases. Again, with uneven development between states. Some states like California are really the ones leading the charge in terms of policy and support mechanisms. And this sort of support is not restricted just to Europe and North America. What we do see is that markets like both Brazil and India are setting up incentives and mandates, either for biomethane use in heavy vehicle transport or grid injection as well. Now, on the next slide, we see a very interesting phenomenon. Low emissions hydrogen is following a similar trend to increased attention being given to stimulating demand. But on this slide, I think there's a very telling snapshot of the state of the market and the risk of a growing imbalance between different segments in the value chain. On the left, what we see is known offtake agreements globally. for low emissions hydrogen, split between preliminary offtake agreements and firm offtake agreements. And on the right, what we see is the volume of potential supply commitments to 2030, which is about 15 times bigger than offtake agreements. So roadmaps and targets have been good in sparking interest in hydrogen and particular interest on the supply side. But there has been more difficulty in identifying potential off-takers for low emissions hydrogen. And if this imbalance were to persist, it would likely represent a significant obstacle in developing low emissions hydrogen target or market, Now, this is somewhat of an alarm bell, but not all hope, of course, is lost. We've seen a conscious evolution in policy and support schemes to better target demand. In the EU, on top of individual member state targets, there's RED III, so the third iteration of the Renewable Energy Directive at the EU level, which is a significant step. The directive essentially sets out requirements, for the origin of a share of hydrogen consumed in both industry and transport. So a certain share of overall hydrogen consumption will have to comply with RFNBO rules. So that's renewable fuels of non-biological origin, which effectively carves out a market segment for low emissions hydrogen in demand. Across the Atlantic, the US Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, includes a clean hydrogen production tax credit. So this was an important development, but again, somewhat skewed to the supply side. And as a result, the Department of Energy announced about $1 billion would be set aside to finance a demand side mechanism, likely channeled through already existing programs like the Regional Clean Hydrogen Hubs program. So again, a turn towards attention being given to the demand side. Individual states in the US have, of course, pushed policies forward, particularly in the transport space, also in industry. I'm thinking notably of California and Colorado. But what we do see is that some of these trailblazer policies in certain states are being adopted in other states as well. So I'll highlight one last market here on this slide, and that's Japan. So Japan has a unique energy context, and that means that its hydrogen policy is essentially revolved around developing a role in the hydrogen technology value chain and as a key off-taker for low emissions hydrogen. Now, that being said, focus on the demand side has been relatively wide-ranging, somewhat agnostic in terms of sector, seeing a generalized role for hydrogen across all sectors. Now, on the one hand, this has the advantage of not excluding options, but it also means that support for demand has effectively or somewhat been diluted, right? In Japan, what we see is that through its updated hydrogen strategy, is an example of how more specific attention is being pushed to the demand side. Here with a focus on making more explicit mention of hydrogen's role in hard-to-abate sectors, as opposed to just broadly in all sectors, and strategizing with respect to the uptake of demand, so notably through the targeting of industrial clusters, for example. Now, these two example slides, bring us to this last slide I'd like to show, which is taking stock of this imbalance and these recent developments in both biomethane and low emissions hydrogen spaces, highlights the importance of targeting policy and support mechanisms across the entire value chain, from supply to demand. Now, demand, on top of being a sort of a raison d'être for developing new markets like these, or also has a key role in stimulating and de-risking supply-side investments. It's not at the end of the process that we should be thinking about these off-takers. Ensuring off-takers is actually absolutely necessary and crucial earlier on in the development, particularly of nascent low-emissions gas markets like these. And there are a number of instruments across the value chain. So these include fiscal incentives, direct grants, contracts for difference. On the demand side, authorities can also set quotas, standards that carve out a guaranteed space for these fuels. And more generally, what we see is that these instruments should work towards promoting a sustainable market structure, helping support long-term offtake agreements, creating these links between supply and demand, and overall creating a sort of confidence, we'll say, at both ends of the value chain, with the broader goal of managing investments and market risks. So as the IEA continues its coverage of low emissions gases and their nascent markets, it will be essential for us to keep an eye on how these mechanisms, how these policies evolve, and how attention is spread across the entire value chain. So on that note, I think I'll wrap up the presentation here, and we're glad to take a few of your questions.
Thanks a lot, Frederick and Gergely. I already received a few questions. Please feel free to post further questions. The first question is looking to the topic about Russia that you, Gergely, mentioned. Do you expect Russian gas imports to EU to continue to increase despite the sanctions? We have to add here that there aren't any sanctions against gas imports from Russia to the EU. But yeah, what do you think, what do you expect with a view to Russian gas imports to EU?
Yeah, no, thank you, Charlie, and many thanks for that very important question. As you pointed out, there is currently no sanctions in place regarding Russian LNG or Russian piped gas. But I think that the latest hydrogen and decarbonized gases markets package creates the legal possibility for countries who wishes to do so to limit their offtake of Russian gas or Russian LNG. So this is already an important step. I mean, when we are looking at the medium term, we don't expect that Russian gas deliveries will increase to the European Union. There is, I think, a clear commitment from the majority of the European countries to diversify away from Russian gas. And we also hear that there is greater attention today on how to reduce imports of Russian LNG into the European Union, and also a number of off-takers of Russian piped gas are also considering to phase it out as soon as possible. So we don't expect that this will increase, but we also wanted to highlight that a certain increase has been happening over the 23-24 winter season. Again, most of that growth was due to higher deliveries to Turkey, but Turkey is also well placed to reduce potentially its imports of Russian gas. On one hand, Turkey is developing at the moment a wonderful gas field, Sakarya, which will be key to reduce its import reliance, including from Russia. But also, Turkey is very well placed to benefit from the changing dynamics in the global LNG market, because Turkey has been very keen on investing into LNG import facilities, both onshore and via FSRUs. And certainly there will be options for LNG procurement in the second half of the decade, when lots of new capacity is coming online. So, I mean, we don't necessarily see that Russian piped gas or Russian LNG deliveries to Europe will increase over the medium term. It is the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Via which pipelines comes Russian gas at the moment to Europe? You mentioned Turkey. We all know that via Nord Stream, no gas is coming anymore to Europe. How important is the Ukrainian transit?
Yeah, when we are looking at the European Union, it is half of the gas is coming from Turk Stream, and the other half is coming from via the Ukrainian route. In the case of Turkey, it is two pipelines which is serving that market, Blue Stream and one of the strings of Turk Stream.
There is another question regarding Russia. How much was the decline of Russian gas exports to EU compensated by an increase of ammonia exports from Russia?
This is an excellent question, and I don't have a response to that now. But this is something we can investigate. Many thanks for Tim for raising that issue. that's something we can look up.
Okay. I want to also have a look once again to the topic of low-emission gases, Frederick. You emphasized the importance of biomethane and hydrogen. How could Germany and other European countries effectively increase the production and the use of these gases?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think part of the point of the section that we included in the gas market report was to say, there has been quite a bit of attention. We're not saying necessarily enough progress on the supply side, but there has been a lot of attention given to the supply side and understanding how can we make the economics work in terms of supplying, in terms of producing. And this is, of course, a big question of integrating sectors, whether it's farming and agriculture, industrial sectors, and the broader energy space. The proper sort of integration of these three elements is key in providing support to the supply side. But I think the point of our section was very much about saying what do we see as levers to increase demand, specific demand for these gases? Has there been enough policy attention, and have there been enough market mechanisms put in place for this? And that's something where we're sort of calling into question the attention that has been given to the sector, whether it's biomethane, whether it's e-methane, or even low emissions hydrogen. And what we think is that we understand the market's sort of levers that exist, the tools that exist. It's more just a question of putting these in place and trying to stimulate that demand by being a little bit more specific and precise in policy towards these market segments.
Mm-hmm. In Germany, there is also a very high discussion about the future of the gas infrastructure. What do you think from the eyes of the IEA? How should the existing gas infrastructure in Europe be adapted to support the integration of hydrogen, the storage of hydrogen, but also the integration of renewables?
Great question. I think you can't escape the question of infrastructure. Now, what we see with biomethane, for example, is that we can, it's not even a question of reusing, but we can say, just injecting this gas into existing infrastructure and existing flows, right? When we do think about other gases, I think we have to be, we're likely going to have to be rather pragmatic about how we go about things. If we see a large move away from natural gas in certain segments, or classic gases in certain segments, it might be untenable to hold different sort of separate and parallel pipeline systems. So it will be key in understanding, how much of this existing system can be eventually repurposed for other segments. But I think the question of how demand for potentially low emissions hydrogen develops will be key in answering this question. Will it be generalized demand? Will it be specific demand in industrial clusters? And this is key in the equation, understanding what sort of new infrastructure or what sort of existing infrastructure we can repurpose.
Mm-hmm. Another question, we are going back to Europe. Gergely, what are the reasons for the decline in gas-powered energy production you suggest for Europe in 2024?
So the reason is very simple. It is the strong expansion of renewable power generation and also improving nuclear availability, mainly in France. We see some recovery in electricity demand, but this is not enough to offer, some additional space for thermal fired generation. And we see that, both coal and gas-fired power generation is declining steeply. Simply, they are being squeezed out by the strong expansion of renewables and higher nuclear availability. I would like just to recall us that we faced, or we have seen, not necessarily faced, but we have seen several days, weekends of negative electricity prices, which really highlights that we have a strong renewable output these days. And of course, this is weighing on thermal generation, including gas.
Because in Germany we have also a very intensive discussion about the coal phase out and the necessity of gas-powered gas-powered energy stations. What do you think when you hear this discussion, or what are you propose what Germany, for example, should do?
Yeah. So I think that this, in a way, ties back to one of the slides we were presenting at the beginning of this presentation, which was showing that despite being a mild winter, we have seen demand peaks across key markets during the 23-24 winter season. And what we see is actually the balancing role of gas-fired power plants is set to increase, especially in the markets which are phasing out coal and at the same time are increasingly reliant on weather-dependent renewables. And I think this is also the case of Germany. So it is important to properly assess this balancing role of gas-fired power plants, and also then to carefully assess the investment needs which are required, not only into the into the power generation facilities, but also potentially across the gas value chain, because it is also about fuel adequacy.
Yeah.
And this includes both midstream and investments required potentially for the imports, especially when we are in a situation where one of the largest supplier historically is not anymore present in the market. So those are, a few thoughts which comes to my mind when I hear such discussions in the German context.
Okay, thank you. We want to take also a look to the low prices in the US. What can Europe or Germany do to benefit from or participate in the currently very low gas prices in the US?
Well, that's a very good question. How we could benefit from those prices? I think the pricing in Europe is very much determined by the local dynamics. So this is the aim of having well-developed and liquid hubs, which are reflective of the regional supply-demand dynamics. So I think that when we are looking at the US LNG export facilities, they are all running close to their nameplate capacity. This is, as much LNG which can be exported to other parts of the world, and of course these exports, they do contribute to lower gas prices in Asia, in Europe. So I think we are already benefiting from that, but there is a limit to that, and this is the nameplate capacity of the export facilities, which have been reached. Of course, there are new liquefaction facilities which are coming online. We mentioned Plaquemines LNG, which is wonderful news that it is going to start up ahead of schedule. But also the United States is a key contributor to the major LNG supply growth in the second half of the decade. So Europe will naturally benefit from that. And what we can do with the Waha prices at $1.3 per MMBtu, I think we can watch those prices with a bit of jealousy, but this is all what we can do. We can't take Waha hub and to put it in Europe, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Frederick. Thank you, Gergely, for these fruitful insights in the international gas market. I think it was, again, very interesting, and we are looking forward to the next report in 3 months. Zusammengefasst für uns in Europa und in Deutschland: Die Lage hat sich in den vergangenen Monaten, das kann man wohl sagen, beruhigt. Das Risiko für unvorhersehbare Preisspitzen, die dann vor allem die Industrie treffen könnten, bleibt aber bestehen. Grund zum einen geopolitische Risiken, zum anderen die steigende Nachfrage im chinesischen Industriesektor. Vielen Dank an Sie, liebe Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer. Vielen Dank für Ihre Fragen und Ihr Interesse. Die Präsentation und den Report werden wir Ihnen im Nachgang zu dieser Veranstaltung zusenden. Eine Aufzeichnung finden Sie zeitnah in unserem YouTube-Kanal. Ich wünsche Ihnen noch einen erfolgreichen Tag und freue mich auf ein Wiedersehen schon in Kürze und bleiben Sie gesund.